1 year later, me being in a hospital bed, not wanting to eat, and being sick with anorexia nervosa, which is nervous loss of appetite, there were just all these really interesting parallels. And I remember the first time I was hospitalized for anorexia, that was this moment where I realized, oh my gosh, like if I want to try to survive this, I need to try to get better. It certainly wasn't a turning point. I ended up being hospitalized on 5 separate occasions and was in residential treatment for a year and a half. But I think that first hospitalization really made me realize that this disorder did not give me what I hoped it would. It didn't make me feel closer to my mother. It didn't give me any real semblance of control, but rather stripped me of those things completely.
Welcome to Coach Soul, the podcast where we explore therapeutic ways to the best versions of ourselves. I'm your host, Steve Hudgins. I'm a licensed professional counselor dedicated to helping you navigate life's challenges. In each uplifting episode, we'll discuss mental health, relationships, self-care, emotional well-being, and personal growth. Join me and with my co-host, Kenya Evelyn, a therapeutic life coach, where sometimes we'll even welcome special guests to our show that share their experience and expertise. So let's embark on this transformative path together and discover a healthier and happier you. Hey, welcome back to Coach Soul. You know, it's a special day because Mallary is here with us, and thank you for joining us. She's got an impactful story. You know, when I think about reading what she has been through, it's just an incredible story. And, you know, when you think about loss, it just, it takes what we love. Control feels like the only thing that's left. But, you know, healing begins the moment when we stop measuring life by what is missing and start nourishing what still remains. And I think that would say a great segue into you, Mallary. Help our listeners and audience kind of tell a little bit about your story, about who you are, and the reason why we're even talking about what we're talking about today.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be on this podcast. And I just recently wrote a book about my experiences having lost my mother to metastatic breast cancer when I was 11, and how that really spurred on the development of anorexia nervosa, which is a disorder that I struggled with throughout my adolescence and was in and out of treatment for through most of my teenage years, and really kind of look at these experiences of grief and loss and what it means to recover. I'm very interested in exploring these questions around what does it mean to be better, but not all better, because I'm someone who's not fully recovered from my eating disorder. And so many of the books and literature I previously had read on eating disorders were either clinical in nature or they were written from the perspective of people who are fully recovered. And I think so many of us live in what I call the middle place, which is this name I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. It's a very populous space, and yet, at least in the eating disorder field, it's not very often talked about. And I think in many ways, the middle place is also an apt term for grief and loss, because many of us don't ever arrive at closure with a capital C. I still grieve the death of my mother, but the load of that weight has lightened over time, but it's still there, right? I'm still in this middle place with my grief as well as with my eating disorder. And so for me as a writer, I'm really keen on just exploring those gray spaces and the nuances that come with recovery from a disorder that nearly took my life when I was younger.
You know, sorry for your loss with your mom. And I just, you know, when you think about losing someone, it impacts you in such a way because we think we're going to live forever, so to speak, until the day comes and reality hits. And, you know, Mallary, when you reflect on losing your mother at age 11, how do you feel that singular moment that shaped your sense of identity and belonging as a young girl?
Such a good question, because for me, losing my mother at age 11 felt like this really pivotal time. It was a time when I was about to begin entering puberty. It was a time when my body was beginning to change, and I didn't have a mom to turn to, seek guidance and help from. And for me, when my mother died, I thought I needed to be strong and resilient. And when my mother had been sick for 3 years with cancer, my family really held on to this this narrative that she was going to be okay. We said she was a soldier in a battle. She was the little engine that could. And even when the cancer had metastasized to her bone marrow, her brain, and her liver, we still kept saying she's going to be fine. And as an 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old, I believed that to be true. So when she did pass away, I really felt like I had lost all control. I felt like my world had crumbled. And yet I still kept holding on to that narrative of I have to be strong, right? I've got to be okay in the midst of this. And for me, I really felt like the more time passed, the farther I felt from my mother. And so I had conjured up this idea that I wanted to stop time. And I thought maybe if I stayed the same size my mother was when she was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And I ended up restricting my food intake, not necessarily thinking that I wanted to develop an eating disorder, but that is what it led to. And for me, the eating disorder was never about being skinny, but more so about being small and safe. And I very much came to identify as the girl without a mother and as the girl with anorexia. And ultimately, a big part of my recovery was learning to reclaim parts of my identity that the disorder had taken away, and also to really learn how to properly grieve the loss of my mother and to recognize that strength doesn't mean being okay and never crying. It means really contending with the loss and experiencing all of the emotions that come with that.
You know, we were talking about your mom, and my question for you is family. Was your family intact? You know, how was your dad dealing with all this at the same time? Because when we think about father figures, they're the leaders in the home, so to speak. They're supposed to be the rock of foundation that stabilizes and holds the family together. You know, I can't imagine all the grief that was happening. Talk a little bit about that experience there.
Yeah, so I am an only child, so I didn't have any siblings to really talk to when my mother was sick and when she passed. And my family is incredibly small. So it was me, my mom, and my dad, and then my grandparents. And outside of that, I had an aunt, an uncle, 2 cousins, but we didn't see them very often. And so my nuclear family was incredibly small. And I really felt that after my mother died, because I would just come home to an empty house every day. There wasn't really family there helping or supporting. And so I think that was really difficult. And for my father, he has always been incredibly loving, and I'm still very close with him to this day. But when I was writing the book, I really had to explore some difficult questions with him, because after my mother died, the following day, my dad sent me to school, and he asked if I was okay going to school. And I said, yes, right? Because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. So he went to work. I went to school. That same week, I wrote my mother's eulogy, and I read it. It's very composed. I didn't cry at all at my mother's funeral when I read that eulogy. And I really had this happy facade. And looking back on that time, I am so struck by the fact that people kept saying I was resilient, including my father. And I thought, why didn't my father question why I wasn't crying? And why didn't he encourage me to feel sad? And why didn't he teach me what grief looked like? And for many years, I felt really angry about that. And I didn't know how to approach that conversation with my father, because I wanted to protect him. But the memoirist in me also wanted answers. And so a couple of years ago, I began talking with him about that period in our lives. And I said, why did you send me to school the day after she died? Did you think it was odd that I didn't cry? And he said, well, I really thought that we needed to try to maintain some normalcy. And he said, I felt like if I had cried after mom died, that you then would have just been crying uncontrollably. And he said, in my mind, I felt like I needed to be strong. And he said, you know me, and my idea of strength is being stoic and not showing that emotion.
Right.
And so he said, maybe I could have handled it differently, but this was so new for me. Suddenly, I was not only a father, but I was a mother as well. And I was trying to grapple with how to best handle this and how to best parent you. And so in talking with him, it was really helpful to hear his perspective and his side of the story. And I think it also helped me to realize how those experiences changed me, because now I'm someone who really likes to explore hard truths, and I don't shy away from difficult conversations, even with my own kids now as a mom. They're 7 and 9, and I don't want to protect them in the ways that my family tried to protect me, because I think that very often truth is our best armor, and being able to explore those hard truths can really help us to grow, can help us to grieve, can help us to recover. And so it was a long process of really looking back on that time and trying to learn from it, and ultimately trying to write about that period, not from a place of blame and anger, but more so from a place of understanding where my father was coming from.
It's interesting that you bring this up, because I try to work with a lot of men in my private practice. And yeah, there's that facade that we're supposed to be the rock. We're the leaders. We are not supposed to be impacted. And as I share with many people, men are taught one emotion, and that's anger. Oftentimes, men don't know how to deal with emotion because we're not taught. We're told to suck it up, move on. As a military veteran, a lot of people who have PTSD, thankfully I don't, but those that I do know, it stems from a lot of different things. And men are just taught to move on, push through. And, this is a time for men that I want to share that it's okay to cry. It's okay to grieve. It helps children to know that emotions are okay, that they can have that safe space with their father to just crawl up in the lap and just be cuddled. It's important to have that. And when you think about that moment in time at 11, writing mom's eulogy, where did you gather the strength to just do that?
I think part of it comes from the fact that I've always identified as a writer. And so I kept journals beginning at age 8. And whenever I feel like I need an outlet, whether it's for sadness or creativity, I turn to writing. And that was true even back then. And so I think for me, in some ways, that was part of how I was trying to cope, was to put words to the page. But at the same time, I still have a copy of that eulogy, and it's heartbreaking to read it, because in many ways, it seemed like I was almost reading at the lectern as if I were a pastor trying to really share these motivational ideas and expressions. And I was telling everyone that my mother was now an angel roaming the streets of gold in heaven, and that she would want us to pick up all the pieces in our life and just move on. And there were so many platitudes that were really rooted in this idea of moving on and picking yourself up by your bootstraps and being strong. And if I look sort of at the space between those words now, I realize that there was so much hiding there, right? So many sort of difficult emotions that I couldn't really put down on the page. And it was easier for me to try to be motivational and sound motivational, even as an 11-year-old. And I, in some ways, thought, I'm going to write this and read this and help all these other people, not really recognizing in that immediate aftermath of loss that I really needed help, right? And I think oftentimes when children display these kind of emotions of strength and resilience, we sometimes are misled into believing that they're okay, right? That they somehow can just bounce back. And maybe that is true for some children, but I think we also need to read between the lines and recognize that often children just don't know how to grapple with grief.
Sure.
I thought grief was something that you experienced in a day and then just got over. I didn't know what it even meant. And so for me as a parent, I'm really mindful of that now in terms of thinking about just children and the appearances that they may sort of show, but trying to explore what's really underneath that happy facade, perhaps, or what's underneath that kind of stoic expression. And I think we need to be able to kind of go there and have those harder conversations with kids.
For those who are listening in, one of the things that I recommend in therapy, I've had several who have difficulty with death and being able to say, if I just go back in time and just tell them I love them or make amends with them, I do a little thing that's a little different from Gestalt therapy. Gestalt therapy does an empty chair technique, and I modified this with those who are in grief, where I say, write a letter as if they're alive. Once you process that, just like you said, that processing tends to help when you write. Go outside, read the letter out loud. Once you're done, burn it. And oftentimes I tell my clients that the smoke and the ash that rises to the air, the four winds of the earth, carry it to your loved one. And I've had so many heal from that progress that I stand behind what you're saying, that writing has some unique gift of healing, of processing, being able to gain that strength. And when you talk about your situation, you're trying to grieve, you're writing this as an adult, so to speak, from a pulpit of lecturing, as you shared earlier. But at the same time, after all this is said and done, at what point did managing the food, feeling like it's a choice, and it started feeling like survival, where did that shift come from for you?
In some ways, with the eating disorder, it was partly about control. I think sometimes when we talk about eating disorders, we distill them down to only being about control. And it was about a lot of different factors for me. But in many ways, I thought about how I couldn't control what happened to my mom's body, but I could control what I put into mine. And I really went into food restriction thinking it would give me back some semblance of control. But very quickly, I would say within 6 months of developing an eating disorder, I really felt completely stripped of all control. And it really took everything that I had to get through every single day. And I felt like I was just barely surviving by the time I was 13 years old, right? I mean, my body was incredibly weak. I had no energy. I really couldn't see a life beyond the eating disorder at that point. And there were some very odd parallels that I didn't really think about as much until I got older. But the most accessible memories I had of my mother were the ones that were most recent. And those were of her lying in a hospital bed, sick, not eating. I looked back at her old medical records, and the doctors had said that they had diagnosed her as positive for anorexia. So she did not have anorexia nervosa, which is what I would go on to develop. But anorexia is essentially just a clinical term for loss of appetite. And because of the cancer and the medication, she wasn't hungry. But then as I think about 1 year later, me being in a hospital bed, not wanting to eat, and being sick with anorexia nervosa, which is nervous loss of appetite, there were just all these really interesting parallels. And I remember the first time I was hospitalized for anorexia, that was this moment where I realized, oh my gosh, like if I want to try to survive this, I need to try to get better. It certainly wasn't a turning point. I ended up being hospitalized on 5 separate occasions and was in residential treatment for a year and a half. But I think that first hospitalization really made me realize that this disorder did not give me what I hoped it would. It didn't make me feel closer to my mother, didn't give me any real semblance of control, but rather stripped me of those things completely.
You know, you shared how your dad reacted when you asked him these questions about, he wanted a sense of normalcy. And here you are, you're going through these grief, trying to control like behaviors. And by the way, listeners, anorexia, bulimia, that's only 2. I believe there are so many different types of eating disorders, especially when you're anxious, stressed. Those are those kind of disorder type things. And so we want to be mindful. But there's something that we need to really hone in and draw out that I find interesting. Your dad wants a sense of normalcy. At what point did he recognize you needed help? Or did you cry out for help?
So I think that this is really important to talk about because it's a challenging issue for so many parents, because I think eating disorders are very largely misunderstood. And when I was really acutely sick in the late 90s, my father, after having seen me restrict my food intake for several months, took me to my pediatrician. And our pediatrician essentially said that what I was experiencing was just a passing phase. And he did not seem terribly concerned about my weight loss, even though I have always lived in a smaller body, and certainly no child should be losing weight at that age, particularly if they're already in a smaller body. And so I then went back home. I continued to restrict my food intake even more severely. Several months later, my father took me back to the pediatrician, who essentially told us the same thing, not to worry. It's just a passing phase. And my father knew that it was much more serious than that. He didn't didn't exactly know what I was struggling with. He had heard of eating disorders, but his only point of reference for them was the death of singer-songwriter Karen Carpenter, who had died in 1983 due to complications from anorexia nervosa. And in my father's mind, he thought that eating disorders only affected adults. And I had read stories about girls with eating disorders and had learned about them in health class, but I was under the misguided perception that people with anorexia didn't eat anything at all. And I was eating a little bit. And so I think that we both had just these misconceptions around what eating disorders were. And eventually my father decided to talk to a family friend who was a nurse, and I interviewed that nurse when I was writing the book, and she said, I took one look at you and just knew that you needed critical care. And so she was the one who told my father to take me to Boston Children's Hospital in Massachusetts, where I grew up, because they had a specialized eating disorder unit. And so he very promptly called them, made an appointment, and then I was admitted that first day that we went to the hospital.
You know, we have to be advocates for our health. We really do. And it's interesting that here a pediatrician says, oh, it's just a phase, it'll pass. And then you have an RN that says, oh, well, I just knew. And it's like you would think a pediatrician would be looking out for your best health. And that question is how did that dismissal, just affect your own understanding of what you were battling?
So in many ways, it felt like maybe I wasn't sick enough. Maybe I wasn't struggling in the right ways. I was really confused about what it was that I was struggling with. And I didn't exactly know why all the foods that I used to love eating with my mom and dad were suddenly very daunting to me. I no longer wanted to eat any of the foods I had once enjoyed. And so hearing the pediatrician say that it was just a passing phase made me think, well, maybe it's something that I'll just grow out of. But at the same time, I knew that this disorder or whatever it was I was struggling with had really taken hold of me, and it was hard for me to envision a way out of it. And so I have since learned that I was at the hands of a pediatrician who knew very little, if anything, about eating disorders. And it really speaks to this larger systemic issue that is still very much at play today. I interviewed a lot of medical doctors when I was working on the book and learned from them and from research that's been published that the average doctor receives 0 to 2 hours of training on eating disorders, which is mind-boggling when you consider the fact that 30 million Americans will struggle with an eating disorder at some point in their lifetimes. And so very often people still today will get dismissed, or they won't be able to receive the treatment that they need because they don't match the stereotypical look of someone with an eating disorder. That stereotypical look is typically a white, teenage, affluent girl. That's sort of the stereotype that many people have in mind when they think of someone who struggles with an eating disorder. And so I think that many people get dismissed and then are led to believe that they're not sick enough. And even as a white girl in a smaller body, as a teenager, I still had difficulty getting help. And I think that over the years, we have kind of grown in our awareness of eating disorders, but there's still so many misconceptions. And I think that that dismissal is really harmful in a lot of ways because it can lead people to not get the treatment that they need or to have to wait much longer than necessary to get treatment. And we know from research that the earlier the prognosis, or the earlier someone receives treatment, the better the prognosis. So the longer folks are waiting to receive care, sometimes the harder it can be to actually get out of these behaviors and disordered thoughts.
And that leaves a great segue into podcast 2. It's just a fascinating story. And that question becomes, the longer we wait, that would be a next question to the segue of how long did it take for you to recover those type of aspects. And so, Mallary, we thank you for today. And we'll catch you on the flip side of part 2 to follow up with that question so that parents can have an understanding, because I want a viewpoint. Now that you're a parent, you have your own 2 kids, is there hypervigilance within you about what they're eating, what they're not eating, those type of things. And so till next time, take care and God bless. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on Coach Soul. As we wrap up, we want to remind our listeners of a few key points. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not substitute professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content shared here is based on professional opinion but may not apply to everyone's situation. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider before making changes to your mental health care. If you're in a crisis, please seek immediate professional help or contact a crisis hotline. Listening to this podcast does not create a therapist-client relationship. For personal advice, please consult with your licensed mental health professional in your area. Remember, your mental health journey is unique. While we hope this information is helpful, it's crucial to work directly with the qualified personnel for your specific needs. Thank you again for tuning in to Coach Soul, and we'll see you next time.